Our son is back. Scott, look at this. Scott looked away from the book, turning his attention to his wife, Eve. She was holding a strange-looking doll with stained hair and a face smeared with something. There were cracks in some places, and two large teeth sticking out of its mouth, which looked very much like human teeth. Torn and crumpled clothes, very small limbs with crooked fingers. This doll looked like it had escaped from a horror movie, and the cheapest one at that, in which they usually made such toys as ugly and scary as possible in order to create fear. It's ugly, isn't it? Scott answered more or less gently so as not to offend. You don't understand. Eve pulled the doll close to her, hugging it tightly. Yeah. It's been a year since their 5-year-old son died. The parents didn't watch. The boy ran across the road to look at the dogs, and then the pack didn't show any friendliness, attacked the child and chewed him to death. And something about the doll's face resembled their son's at that moment. Red, bruised, with two big teeth sticking out of the flesh. Only it was like the doll had dipped its face in a pile of shit, and then it was happy. Aren't you glad? Our baby's back. Of course, darling. I'm very happy. Eve stared at her husband intently, stroking the doll. Scott turned back to the book. Of course he was hurt by the loss of his son, but going to such extremes was not his thing. It made it worse, like picking at an old wound, and the thought of his beloved wife losing her mind made the situation not a pleasant one. You're not happy, Scott. In fact, you don't care. He didn't pay attention as she walked away. Just listened to the loud footsteps and sobs, then the slam of the door, and silence. Scott set the book aside and squeezed his eyes shut. There were no more tears left, but he wanted to cry. Soon he would lose his wife. A week later, Eve came out of the room. She still had the doll with her. Scott tried not to look at such a creepy replacement son. They just talked peacefully about how they would spend the weekend. Summer was in full swing. Why not have a picnic? It's been a while since they've been outdoors for a little refreshment, a break from the hustle and bustle of the city. Scott would have talked about the doll, but he didn't bring it up. He didn't want to upset his wife again. Maybe she'd play with it for a while and then it would go away. At least, Scott hoped it would. When the weekend came, they all got together, Scott, Eve, and the son. It's a pretty strange picture. The couple is laughing, chatting, eating delicious food like a picnic is supposed to do, but there's a creepy-looking doll sitting nearby, watching. Watches the couple enjoying themselves, the birds and small animals. Listens to the talking, the singing, and the rustling of the grass. Feels the moments of wind. It's as if the doll is alive. Or pretends to be? Life was gradually getting better. Eve was able to calm down thanks to the doll. Scott ceased to be annoyed at the behavior of his beloved, even sometimes played along with his wife himself, playing with his son. This was happiness. The family in full, if so it can be considered. Now life does not seem so gray. But everything is just beginning. Only everything got better as suddenly there was another attack. Eve began to weaken. Every day it got worse and worse. Scott even took time off work to be near his sick wife. Doctors only spread their hands, prescribed some medications that did not help Eve recover in any way. All this time, the doll was by his side. She watched the suffering of the poor girl, and the only medicine keeping Eve sane and sensible. Scott was glad for that. At least somehow his beloved clung to life. Soon Eve began to rave, calling for her son, screaming and moaning loudly. At times like this, her body would twist. That's when Scott noticed something strange on his wife's body. There was a perfectly round wound above her navel, covered in a hard crust of flesh and slightly bulging. You could see something pulsing beneath the crust. Scott gingerly touched the wound, but his wife stopped him in an instant, taking his wrist firmly. which surprised Scott. Eve became normal for a moment, glared angrily at her husband, and spoke through gritted teeth. "Don't touch it." Afterwards, the gray skin color and sickly look of his wife returned. Scott couldn't believe what had happened. His gut told him that something was definitely wrong. Now life was like a horror movie. Scott quit his job, stayed home all day, all to get his wife back. She's not the Eve he knew. She's gone insane, thin and gray, like the plague. A pitiful semblance of a human being. And that doll, Eve wouldn't part with it for a second. Scott tried to take the creepy toy away, but Eve wouldn't let him. It was too late to make any attempt to get rid of the doll. Turning to a specialist, Scott wasn't willing to do that. He wasn't ready to accept the fact that everything that was happening was beyond any human laws. Maybe his gut was deceiving him. Maybe it was all a bad dream. If only. Scott had already dropped his hands. He was at a loss. He didn't know what to do. And he was gradually turning into a pathetic semblance of a human being, because since the beginning of all these events began to slowly drink. The only solution to all his problems was cheap booze. Soon, and it will run out, because the budget is not infinite to spend on booze. At times, all together, Scott, Eve, and the son would get together like in the good old days. Sitting in the living room, in complete silence, each in their own projection. The lights hadn't been on for a long time, and there was hardly any food left, just empty bottles, feces, and vomit. The smell of urine was so stale it had become analogous to air freshener. Eve played with her son, telling him various stories. Scott paid no attention to it. He even forgot that he didn't live alone. And during another one of these meetings, Scott noticed something. As he looked at the doll, it seemed to him that the toy was beginning to take on some semblance of flesh. Not even that. The plastic, or whatever the doll was made of, was crumbling, and bare flesh began to emerge from underneath the exposed areas. Even the black eyes fell away, replaced by real human eyes of murky color. Teeth began to show, and the hair grew noticeably. And the doll itself got a little bigger. The funny thing is, Scott didn't react to any of this. He blamed it on the fact that he'd gotten so drunk that the dolls were turning into real children. One day Scott heard a strange sound that woke him from his sleep, as if someone was greedily sucking up the rest of his juice. Scott decided to see if it was him. He took a nearby chair as a defense. Holding his weapon firmly in his hands, Scott walked out into the living room. Sounds were coming from his wife's room. Heading there, Scott carefully placed his ear against the door. His hand slowly lay on the doorknob. With a slight push and opening the door, Scott flew into the room, ready to attack, but the chair fell out of his hands. The very same doll sat on top of Eve, sucking everything out of her with its long trunk like a mosquito. The flesh pulsed, secreting a transparent slime. Its cloudy eyes ran around the room until they turned their gaze to Scott, who had just entered. The proboscis had torn away from his wife's body, now a veritable leather bag of bones. A wide grin appeared from beneath the trunk, something that looked like a grotesque likeness of a fly, and a man squeaked loudly, bouncing in place. "Now it's your turn, Daddy. I hope you're just as delicious."